Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this fourth session on motivation. Still got a bit to get through, but I hope to conclude it today and conclude it with a brief summary of everything we've done so far, because I realise the complexity involved in what we've been looking at. Now, today I'm going to pick up on something that we've touched on before as a starting point, just to go over it, because it leads into the final bits of motivation I want to talk about. So I'm going to start off by looking at intrinsic and extrinsic motivation again. Now, intrinsic motivation exists within the individual and is driven by satisfying internal rewards rather than relying on external pressures or extrinsic rewards. It involves an interest or an enjoyment of the activity itself. For example, an athlete may enjoy playing football for the experience rather than for an award. Activities involving their own inherent reward provide motivation that is not dependent upon external rewards. That's the critical issue to remember with intrinsic. Pursuing challenges and goals comes easier and is more enjoyable when one is intrinsically motivated to complete a certain task. For example, because an individual is more interested in learning rather than achieving a goal, it has been argued that intrinsic motivation is associated with increased subjective well-being. Now, I can apply that principle to myself because I am studying theology in a very systematic way, not because I necessarily want to gain some reward from that in the terms of a doctorate in theology, but I'm more concerned for learning's sake. And I suspect that that's also true for yourselves. According to some theorists, the two necessary elements for intrinsic motivation are self-determination and autonomy. Autonomy, that's an important word to remember. Autonomy is about self-control, being self-reliant. But it also, of course, requires a level of competence. On this view, the cause of the behavior must perceive the task increases their competence. Social contextual events like feedback and reinforcement can cause feelings of competence and therefore contribute to intrinsic motivation. I know in my own studies, I often go back to my tutor and discuss things that I'm not quite clear about and need to relate specifically to myself and my own knowledge of the Bible and the Word of God. In situations where choices, feelings, and opportunities are present, intrinsic motivation is increased by people feeling a greater sense of autonomy. In other words, they have to feel a greater sense of control of the situation. Indeed, some studies suggest that there is a negative correlation between external rewards and intrinsic motivation, i.e., they're providing a high external reward for an activity. The intrinsic motivation for it required tends to be somewhat lower. That's interesting because that's a principle I'm going to be picking up as we redesign this program. The new ADAPT program will have different levels. It will have a certificate level, a diploma level, and an ordination level. And they will all be delivered in terms of content slightly differently. Various studies have focused on intrinsic motivation of students, which you are. They suggest that intrinsically motivated students are more likely to engage in the task willingly and work hard to improve their skills, which tend, in result, to mean they have increased capabilities. Students are more likely to be intrinsically motivated if they can attribute their educational results to factors under their own control, also known as autonomy, or as psychologists prefer to call it, locus of control. However, they believe they have the skill to be effective agents in reaching their desired goal, also known as self-efficacy or beliefs. And finally, they're interested in mastering a topic, not just for achieving good grades. Good grades are one thing. Mastering a topic is something completely different. Traditionally, researchers thought of motivations in a whole kind of different ways. Often view motivation as a kind of a systems-based approach used primarily to fulfill the user's intrinsic motivation. For instance, I think I mentioned before, online gaming, virtual world, online shopping, online dating, digital music, social networking, can all give general gratification and intrinsic motivation to people. Intrinsic motivation tends to be more long-lasting, self-sustaining and satisfying than extrinsic motivation, which tends to be more short-lived. For this reason, many efforts in education aim to modify intrinsic motivation with the goal of promoting student learning, performance and creativity. Yet, various studies have suggested that intrinsic motivation is hard to modify or inspire. Attempts to recruit existing intrinsic motivators requires an individualized approach. They involve identifying and making relevant the different motivators to make that person, the student, achieve at a greater level. This often requires additional skills from the teacher. Mindfulness has been found to be an intrainable individual factor that supports autonomous motivation and therefore contributes to intrinsic motivation. But let's move on and consider, just checking my watch for time here, extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation occurs where an individual is given an external influence to motivate them. These can be either rewards, money, good grades, fame, celebrity, or they can be some form of punishment, threats of punishment, pain, etc. The distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation lies in the driving force behind the action. When somebody is intrinsically motivated, they engage in activity because it is inherently interesting, enjoyable, or satisfying. Whereas with extrinsic motivation, the agent's goal is a desired outcome, distinct from the activity itself. The agent can have both intrinsic and extrinsic motives for the same activity, but usually one type of motivation outplays or outweighs the other. I remember when I was consulting that sometimes the sum of money people were going to pay me to do a certain job outweighed the intrinsic motivation I had in the pleasure I would actually get in doing that particular piece of work. Playing tennis, for example, to receive an award is an example of extrinsic motivation, whilst playing just because one enjoys the game involves intrinsic motivation. Now, some studies indicate that extrinsic rewards can lead to overjustification and a subsequent reduction in intrinsic motivation. In one study demonstrating this effect, children who were expected to be and were rewarded with a ribbon and a gold star for drawing a picture spent less time playing with the drawing materials in subsequent observations than children who were assigned to an unexpected reward condition. So those that were not knowing what the reward was tended to outperform those who knew specifically what it was. The argument there being, of course, is they did the minimum possible to get the ribbon and the star. This indicates there is a tendency to care less about the activity itself than the reward that is expected. However, yet other studies suggest that positive and negative extrinsic motivation can increase intrinsic motivation. This leads us to the assumption that the effect of extrinsic motivation on intrinsic motivation may depend on the type of the reward. According to an article called Self-Determination Theory and the Facilitation of Intrinsic Motivation and Social Development and Well-Being, that's a mouthful, a lot of what we do after childhood is not inspired by intrinsic motivation because we are not solely doing things anymore to satisfy our intrinsic motivators, but is instead done more to satisfy extrinsic motivators, since we must adhere to social pressures which force us to do things that we are not intrinsically motivated to do. One advantage of extrinsic motivation is that it can be used relatively easily to motivate other people to work towards goal completion, something we try and use within Christian warriors. One disadvantage is that the quality of work may need to be monitored, since the person might otherwise not be motivated to do a good job. Extrinsic motivation fueling engagement in the activity soon ceases once the external rewards have been removed. It has been seen that extrinsic motivators may diminish in value over time. For me, when I made my first million, money was still important to me, but it started to become less important because it was just more of the same, effectively. John Marshall Reeve, a psychologist, distinguishes between 4 different types of extrinsic motivation that involves different degrees of autonomy. He talks about external regulation, introjected regulation, identified regulation, and integrated regulation. External regulation is the least autonomous form of extrinsic motivation. In it, the consequence of the action counts for the person. For example, if a student wants a good grade, they are motivated to study for that grade. Introjected regulation arises from the person's impression of what they should do. For instance, a student knows that they should study and does not want to feel the guilt that comes with not studying, so they do it. Identified regulation comes from what the person believes is personally important. In the example of the student, they may have an understanding that studying is important to their success and will pursue their studies for that reason. Integrated regulation is the most autonomous form of extrinsic motivation and occurs where the motivation arises from the impression of personal identity that forms within the person completing the task. This type of extrinsic motivator is very close to intrinsic motivation, but not quite there. This is because the individual is motivated to engage in an activity by which he or she will express their values instead of by pure interest and enjoyment. In this case, a student studies because doing so expresses their core values and reflects how they see themselves as a person. And as we know, core values determine how we live our lives. A student intrinsically motivated study would be so purely thinking because they think studying is interesting and fun. I want to move on from that to talk a little bit about unconscious and conscious. Conscious motivation involves motives of which the agent is aware. In the case of unconscious motivation, on the other hand, the agent may be partially or fully unaware of why he or she acts in the way they do. Unconscious motivation is a distinction placed on the important role of probably the father of psychotherapy, Sigmund Freud, and his theories. According to him, the unconscious contains various repressed parts of our mind, like anxiety-inducing thoughts and socially unacceptable ideas. He identifies censorship as a force that keeps the repressed part from entering consciousness. But the unconscious instinctual impulses can nevertheless have a great influence on behavior in the form of unconscious motivation. Now, when these instincts serve as a motivator, the person is only aware of the goal of the motive and not its actual source. Freud divides these instincts into three: sexual instincts, death instincts, and ego or self-preservation instincts. Sexual instincts are those that motivate humans to stay alive and ensure the continuation of mankind. On the other hand, Freud also maintains that humans have an inherent drive for self-destruction, the death instinct, if you like, similar to the devil and the angel that everyone has on their shoulder. The sexual instinct and death instincts are constantly battling with each other, so both can be satisfied. The death instinct can be closely related to Freud's other concepts, the id, which is our need to experience pleasure immediately, regardless of the consequences. The last type of instinct that contributes to motivation is the ego or self-preservation instinct. This instinct is geared towards assuring that a person feels validated in whatever behavior or thoughts they have. The mental censor or door between the unconscious and preconscious helps satisfy this instinct. For example, one may be sexually attracted to a person due to their sexual instinct, but the self-preservation instinct prevents them to act on this urge until that person finds it is a socially acceptable thing to do. Quite simply, in his psychic theory that deals with the id, ego, and superego, Freud's theory of instincts highlights the interdependence of those three instincts. All three serve as checks and balances in a system which controls what instincts are acted upon and what behaviors are used to satisfy many of them at once. Priming is another source of unconscious motivation. It's a phenomenon whereby exposure to a particular stimuli influences a response to a subsequent stimuli without conscious guidance or intentions. For example, when someone is exposed to the word cancer, they are afterwards less likely to smoke a cigarette offered to them. There are various forms of priming, but visual and semantic priming are the most relevant for all motivation theories because of the link to the external stimuli. Priming is closely related to exposure theory, which states that people tend to like things that they have been exposed to before. This is used by advertising companies to get people to buy their products. In product placement in movies and on our TVs, for example, we see a product in our favorite movie, which makes us more inclined to buy that product when we see it again. Another example comes from former drug users who are more tempted to relapse when exposed to stimuli associated with drugs. Now, it's quite interesting. We use exposure theory quite a lot within Christian Warriors for God. Some of you I know have heard me talk about it and refer to it as flooding. It is a technique that essentially is about overwhelming the person so that our thoughts, their thoughts, are particularly directed repetitively, almost habitually, towards a certain goal. hence the need to keep putting out the same sorts of posts to people to get messages understood. Now, that concludes really all I want to say about motivation. I say all I want to say. I've been talking for 2 hours on the subject. I just want to finally quickly go through what we've covered in all 4 sessions. If you remember, we started off by looking at a definition of motivation and then moved on to look at motivation and mental states and the strength and desire of actions. We then went on to content theories. We looked particularly at Maslow, hierarchy of needs, Herzberg's 2-factor theory, Alderfer's ERG theory, and self-determination theory. And in particular, we looked at classical and operant conditioning, incentive motivation, motivation operations, which if you remember I referred to as MO, and William McDougall's purpose psychology. After that point, we touched on drives and then moved on to the types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. We have looked at unconscious and conscious motivation. I have deliberately avoided talking about neuroscience because we're getting then into a different level again in terms of our study on this subject. We've looked at the motivational reasons and rationality and indeed some of the practical applications. Now these modules on motivation are really about the applications of motivation in business, because as I think we all agree, running Christian Warriors for God has to be run like a business. So we need to be considering all of these theories in terms of how we design and the characteristics we build into jobs, how we give people recognition, etc. And finally, we touched a little bit on motivation in education, both indigenous education and indeed in the more formal kind of education or learning, the kind of thing that you're actually going through at the moment. Well, the good news is that it's only taken me 22 minutes to cover that. But in the previous 3 sessions, we've covered a lot of material. And I'm going to be asking you in your assignment this week to reflect on everything we've covered. And I want an essay from you, a lengthy essay of what you've covered, what you've learned throughout all 4 sessions, and how you believe you can apply it to your work, to your life. I don't necessarily want you giving me all the models and theories again, but I want you to be able to say to me, hey, as an individual, I tend to use this kind of motivation for myself, for other people, etc. So this essay, this assignment, is very closely focused on me trying to get a grip on your understanding of what you've learnt and its application to you today and indeed in the future. So we move on next week. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know I haven't even looked at the syllabus. I'm not sure what it is, but we've got to be getting somewhere near teens and a little bit then moving towards presentations and managing change. There's still subjects that we've got to get into. So enjoy your assignment. I hope you found it, if not a bit overwhelming, but if you get the chance to watch it 2 or 3 times, that you can really draw something out of it. God bless you all. See you all soon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.